right, so we're getting to that part of the day where probably you think you've heard about many of the issues already, and it's you may be getting a little fatigued sitting in a theater, this beautiful theater. But I'm hoping this last session will really help us integrate what we've heard today and pull together some of the wonderful presentations we've heard and some of the very interesting points of analytic disagreement among our speakers, which is a normal and healthy thing to expect, I think. But we're going to try to now look more in a more sort of connected way on where are the points of continuity, change, agreement, disagreement in the US-ROK alliance. So we're trying to pull together, you know, how do we visualize the areas in which have things gotten better, in part because of the summit, the leadership changes, or are there enduring areas where we just see the problem set differently, but we're managing it in the structure of the alliance. So in the course of our presentations this afternoon, I hope we'll hear about how the two parties are setting priorities in security matters. Do we rank the problems in similar ways? Do we think about sequencing them or structuring engagement with North Korea in similar ways? How more broadly can we work together to improve Indo-Pacific, Asia-Pacific security cooperation? Are we looking at the China problem set in similar or at least compatible ways? So I think we heard a little bit about that in the second panel. And do we have an honest and open dialogue between Washington and Seoul over different scenarios for how things might play out on the Korean Peninsula? And I think at the very end of the second session, we had some interesting insights about generational change and what are the real goals and strategic objectives. And we have a wonderful panel. We're going to go first to Mr. Robert Collins, who is one of those Americans with very deep expertise on Korea. He's lived here for a good number of years, a veteran of both the Army and as a civilian employee of the Department of the Army, currently advising the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea. We'll then turn to General Chun Im-bum, who also has a distinguished career as a military officer. He's been affiliated with a number of American think tanks and works currently with the National Bureau of Asian Research. And last, we'll turn to Dr. Han Intaek from the Jeju Peace Institute. The Peace Institute is on the island of Jeju, as you may know, and holds an annual forum for peace and prosperity that some of us at the Schar School have had the privilege of participating in. So I really look forward to these very distinct and different perspectives on the US-ROK alliance and help us sort of end the day with some analytic appreciation of where are the trends and where are the areas of continuity but also change. So thank you very much, and I'm going to invite Mr. Collins to come up first. Thank you. And the rules are the same. The speakers will get a 5-minute warning and a 1-minute warning. Okay, thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank George Mason University for inviting me to this CSPS-K. It's quite an honor to participate in this wonderful setting. But I have to say I'm a bit intimidated. What intimidates me is all the youth that is in this room. At 72, I'm probably the oldest person in the room. And so your youth is quite impressive to me. A lot of people think that my thought process isn't quite what it used to be. And many of my Korean friends just call me Chibe-sensei, and which means Mr. Dementia. So you're probably hearing some of that coming out of me as we talk over the next 15 minutes. But I got to tell you, I'm here to deliver some bad news. So for those of you that are students of the security environment, not only in Northeast Asia, but on the Korean Peninsula, and even if you're a ROK citizen, this is serious stuff. And it needs to be paid attention to, the challenges that North Korea gives to not only the ROK-US alliance, but directly to President Yoon are pretty overwhelming. What do I mean by that? The extremes of North Korea are more extreme than at any other time in the history of the peninsula since 1953. So President Yoon is experiencing these extremes, and he has to deal with those, as does the alliance. Now, what do I mean by the extremes? Well, on the one hand, you have strengths of the Kim regime. On the other hand, you have weaknesses of the Kim regime. And debatably, one could say before that the 1990s and Kim Jong-il's arduous march was the most extremely threatening time for the Kim regime in North Korea. Well, those extremes aren't nearly as extreme as they are today. We're about to see the North Korean people become as malnourished as they were in the 1990s. But in the 1990s, North Korea didn't have nuclear weapons. They didn't have ICBMs. And they didn't have all the cyber warfare capability that they have today. And so the extremes here are pretty much influencing all major decisions, or should be at least, in terms of how does President Yoon now deal with North Korea? How does the ROK-US alliance deal with North Korea? President Yoon's going to be on top of this much more than the U.S. president. And the U.S. president is probably dominated by his policy in Ukraine right now. But the meaning of these weaknesses presents a problem, particularly for you as students, in terms of understanding where and how does this matter to me? Well, let's start at the basics. The weaknesses of North Korea start with policy. And the policy is done by the Korean Workers' Party, which runs North Korea. The DPRK government does not run North Korea whatsoever. They take policy from the party and implement it as they're told. And this kind of control happens in every village, every county, every province, every city, and every military unit, every security service element throughout North Korea. I'll give you an example of what I mean. In the military, from the battalion on up, and frontline companies along the DMZ, there is a political officer that sits side by side with the commander. And that political officer has a way of controlling that commander in a way that doesn't happen in the ROK military, it certainly doesn't happen in the United States military and most Western militaries. And that political officer controls exactly what that commander is doing. So in our words, from our view, a North Korean military commander is really nothing more than a glorified S3 or an operations officer. He's nothing like being a commander in other militaries. And so the control over the apparatus that the party gives, these political officers ultimately work for the party, ensures that there is a stubborn, even paused relationship between the command rules and the commands given. And this becomes very problematic, and you'll see why as I get further into this. The other weaknesses are resources, old equipment, malnutrition. These are all big problems that not only face the entire North Korean population, but cause some pretty severe problems in terms of being able to conduct business, i.e. support the economy. And we all know that that's pretty weak. It's kind of remarkable that we have gotten this far. I remember coming here in 1972. That was the first time I came here. And since that time, I've lived in Korea for 40 years. So for some of you students, I've lived in Korea twice as long as you have. But at any rate, back then, when I first got here, one of my first jobs was debriefing North Korean defectors. At the time, North Koreans and South Korean stature physically was about the same. Even the North Korean economy was a little better than the South Korean economy, which wasn't very good back then. But for the Koreans that are in my generation, I saw them work their tails off to build a country that went from a donation reception to a primary donor within the international community. Very few countries have ever done that. In the meantime, the Koreans are all bigger. Now the North Koreans that defect, they're all smaller. And that's an indication of just how weak that the regime is in treating its own people. And I would say that the number one enemy of the Kim regime is the North Korean people because they threaten his control. Now, the other side with the nukes, the missiles, the cyber warfare capability, these are all major extremes that, when you combine the extremes of the weaknesses and the extremes of the strengths, again, put President Yoon and the ROK-US alliance in a position that none of their predecessors have ever done before. And so what brings all this together is this COVID issue. Now that they have finally acknowledged that they have a mass coronavirus spread within North Korea, this is a major problem. And I'll give you an example of the problem. When you see on the news that what China does to barricade people within Beijing and Shanghai, you see that they put fences around the apartment complexes and don't let them come out of their apartments. Well, because they build up just like South Korea does. But in North Korea, the only place where they can build up is in Pyongyang. Every place else, they don't do that, for the most part. And so most of the people live in villages within valleys. So what the North Koreans are going to do, or what the Kim regime is going to do, is they're just going to blockade valleys and tell people that they can't come out of the villages. And they'll use the local security and the local party members to enforce that. One of the big problems of facing that is that this is the monegi season, or the season where you do the planting of all your vegetables and rice and whatnot. And usually during this time period, the North Korean military has to stop training and goes out and helps the farmers doing the planting. Well, now they can't go into those valleys. Now, 2 years ago, if you think of a corn cob, you know, if you drive through Iowa, you know, in October, you got corn cob stacks that go, 12 feet high, and a corn cob is about 12 inches long. In North Korea, 2 years ago, it was 8 inches, but last summer it fell down to 6 inches because they had such a drought. Now they're not going to be able to plant enough, and those issues are going to turn that corn cob into 4 inches. The malnutrition thing that I talked about, about 40% of the population is malnourished. They're going to be even greater malnourished. Their ability to resist the coronavirus is going to be non-existent. The health system is almost non-existent. It failed in the 1990s. And so what this brings us to is, how stable can the Kim regime remain? Think about that. Are there threats to its stability? And what does that mean for Kim Jong-un? What does that mean for President Yoon? Well, the problem is, obviously, that as things get worse and Kim Jong-un is unable to do things or get things accomplished, and you see glimpses of this in the KCNA reporting out of North Korea, the problem is things aren't getting done, and he's getting reports that they are being done. And the problem is, like many other countries, North Korea has corruption. I think every country does have that. But in North Korea, it's very, very prevalent. And in today's North Korea, corruption is the way of survival. And so he's not getting accurate reports, and once he does get some accurate reports, it becomes problematic. Why did he choose to now publish the statistics about the coronavirus? So the spread of coronavirus in North Korea. Well, he finally realized probably realized what a big problem that was. At what point does this cause him to miscalculate? That's President Yoon's problem. That's a problem for the ROK-US alliance. And I would say that the biggest problem is this miscalculation by Kim. And when he does a miscalculation, what are the strengths that he has in order to overcome that, or even to respond, or to try to get out of the situation? Nukes, missiles, cyber warfare, and perhaps even using his conventional forces to accomplish certain tasks along the DMZ and the Northwest Islands. That's something that we can truly expect. So the point is, President Yoon and his staff have a lot of planning to do, particularly when it comes to instability and how the Kim regime may be folding. And that's very, very problematic. So for you as students, everything that you study in terms of trying to come up with something that is going to be a resolution to make things better, and probably after you graduate you're going to be assistants to people that try to make these decisions and make these plans. You have to start with what is the worst case scenario, and then work forward from there in order to come up with a solution or a recommendation that would help your seniors or the South Korean government or President Yoon in how to deal with this. And so the bad news is, how does one deal with a miscalculation by Kim Jong-un under certain circumstances? It's going to impact not only South Korea, it'll impact the alliance, but it'll impact Northeast Asia as well. And with that, I think I'll stop talking, because I'm probably going to be accused of chime.
Thanks so much, and that very sobering analysis, it does focus the mind, I would say, on how do the ROK and the US think together about worst case contingencies and what kinds of responses might be warranted. In the past, we've been able to respond to acute humanitarian needs, less clear whether the North Koreans will even, agree to help on their COVID crisis. But what we've also explained is that this could turn into something well beyond just the humanitarian requirements. So thank you for that. I think we'll turn now to General Chun.
I think I was the smallest guy in the photo. So I want to thank everybody for coming out today, and especially for the invitation. I am a retired lieutenant general, I'm not active duty, and I am a Korean officer. Bob, it's great to see you again. He was my mentor. I look up to him then and now, even if he does have chime. So I prepared 6 items that would have been of interest to you between the Korean and Americans on the military security side. But since I only have 15 minutes, I'm going to talk about just 2 of them. One is the United Nations Command, and the other is the return of Yongsan base and some of the issues that are arising from that. Now, if I had more time, I would have talked about, number 1, the importance of combined exercise and training, and how different exercise and training is, because they're not the same. At the same time, I would have told you that it was worthwhile to sacrifice this very critical element of readiness for the purpose of giving peace a chance. But now we're unfortunately in a situation that we have to relook at our options. And unfortunately, the options are not that good. I would have continued with my second issue, which is the importance of the ROK government to participate in these combined exercises. For the past 4 years, the Korean government has not participated in these exercises. Now what happens during this phase is we Koreans decide whether we're going to go to war, whether we're going to accept nuclear weapons as a means of reaction, whether we're going to mobilize, whether we're going to do all these very critical things. And yet, we have not participated during the last 4 years. I would have asked you to think about how negligent that is. But I would also have told you that it was not just the Moon government that did this. It was the conservatives as well. It was Park Geun-hye's government, and it was Lee Myung-bak's government. So I'm very curious as to what the Yoon government is going to do during the next August exercises. Will they participate as they should? Or are they going to be just an extension of goofing off and putting us at peril and then whining about Americans doing things without consultation when we did not even go to the meeting in the first place? Third, I would have explained to you how important it is to have better relations with the Japanese. You know, guys, gals, I don't care what you call an island, what you call their emperor, or other issues. We need to separate security issues from all the historical, all the naming, all the territorial issues. Security for the Japanese and the Koreans are vital. I would have explained to you that we need to have better relations with the Japanese military, and the Japanese military also recognizes the importance of having that kind of relationship for their own security. I would have talked to you about OPCON, Wartime Operational Control, but we don't have time. So I'll go to the main two items. Number one is the United Nations Command. So recently, there's been a suspicion about the United Nations Command. The United Nations Command was created in 1950 during the Korean War by the United Nations to restore peace on the Korean Peninsula and to maintain peace. The way they do it now is by observing and making sure that the armistice agreement is kept. And if for some unfortunate reason we should have another war on the Korean Peninsula, that we will be able to integrate all those nations that will come to our aid. Notice what's happening in Ukraine. They can't even get a UN resolution because that's what the UN has turned into. We don't have that problem. We already have a United Nations Command, and any nation that wants to come to the aid of the Koreans can do so through this mechanism. But recently there has been suspicion towards the United Nations Command. Number one, some Koreans think that the United Nations Command is hindering inter-Korean relations. They cite that some of the initial exchanges between the North and South was hampered by the United Nations Command. It is not true. Some people think that the United Nations Command, because it's trying to expand, is trying to control us Koreans. Do you actually think that the Americans can control the Korean military? Do you know what happened during the Korean War? The Americans did not want us to go north of the 38th parallel, but we just did it anyway. The Americans did not want us to release the anti-communist prisoners down south, but we just did it anyway. When an American tells us something that we don't like, we just say, "Me no speaky English." That's a great way of solving the problem. The expansion of the revitalization of the United Nations Command is trying to turn a 50-man organization into a 200-man organization. Of that 200, 150 of them will be Koreans. Whoever would do that if they wanted to control us through the United Nations Command. So everything that you hear about the negative aspects of the United Nations Command either has a different story to it or there's an explanation. Now, the United Nations Command is not perfect. I'm not saying they are. But there are other aspects. And the bottom line is, it's in our best interest of the Koreans to have a robust United Nations Command, whatever the cost may be. Finally, I want to mention about the return of Yongsan base. About a month ago, YTN reported that we have a big problem with Yongsan, that it's contaminated. It's contaminated with cancer-causing elements, which is true. But it's not as if the entire base is contaminated. Most of the contaminants are in the repair shop, the maintenance shop, the maintenance factory, the fuel shop, places where fuel can be spilled. Now, people imply that it was the Americans, but we really don't know. It could have been the Mongolians 1,000 years ago. It could have been the Japanese 100 years ago. So we can't be 100% sure. But even if this was true, we need to think about a couple of things. Number one, if American children were living there for 50 years and they had no cancer, how can we say it's dangerous? If American children were living there for 50 years. Now in 2001, the Korean government, which was then Kim Dae-jung, agreed to a SOFA, Status of Forces Agreement, that acknowledged the standards of what we would consider something that is dangerous for human health. It was an American standard. Now, I personally am not happy that we agreed to that. But let me remind you, we agreed to it. This standard is the same standard that the Americans use back home in the United States. And they have legal trials every day, which continues for like 10, 20 years. So what we agreed upon was we were going to use the same kind of standards in Korea. It's called KISC, or KISI, Known Imminent Significant Endangerment to Life. If there is a contaminant, we must know it, it must be imminent, it must be significant, and it must endanger the life of a person. How vague are these standards? Now, there was a KBS special just a couple of weeks ago. It was a 30-minute compelling story saying that the whole place was contaminated by cancerous elements. 500 times, 5,000 times more than the Korean standard. Even if it was true, we have to prove that it's imminent, that it's significant, and it's endangerment to Korean lives. If an American 7-year-old was living there for 5 years and hasn't gotten cancer, how are we going to prove that? Now, in order to do this, some Koreans advocate that we must do a detailed study of the entire compound. And that once the study is complete, we will have to negotiate as to who will pay for the treatment of that area. Do you know how long it'll take to do that survey? Maybe 5 to 10 years. Then the negotiation is going to be another 5 to 10 years. How can I say this? Because 15 years ago, we returned American bases, and some of them are still not in use because we did the same thing. Now, the Yoon government, I support this, has said, nope, we're going to accept these bases and do the study and see what happens. I think that's a good idea because there's a thing called opportunity cost. Just imagine Yongsan being empty for 20 years, us not being able to use it. Can you imagine the cost of that? So let's take back the base, improve it, and if there's money to be paid, I'm sure somebody will be more than willing to pay for prime property in Yongsan. But in order for you as voters, you will have to decide. And in order for you to do the right kind of deciding, because there's no right and wrong in these kind of issues. There should only be informed and intelligent selection. And you can only do this if you come to things like this, to endure some of the sleepy arguments and lectures that some people give, in these kind of sessions. But you need to know what the issues are. These issues are going to be long and tiresome and very complex. But that is the only way you can become masters of your own destiny. Otherwise, you're going to just be swept. I think that's it. So I would enjoy any questions that you might have, and thank you again for having me here.
Thank you so much, General Chun. I think this was such a useful reminder that a long-standing security partnership like between the United States and the Republic of Korea, we spend a lot of our time thinking about the existential issues and what are the big threats, but it's also a business relationship where there's just a lot of very concrete, difficult legal and engineering and physical requirements that can lead to kind of long-term friction in the relationship, even if we agree in the big picture, but on the sort of doing business together, it can be hard. It reminds me of how many generations have fussed over what the U.S. should do about Okinawa in Japan. And these issues in a democratic society can get really entrenched in, other domestic political struggles over defense budgets and over, legal permissions, environmental sensitivities, etc. And certainly if people have been exposed to, toxic, materials, there's yet another litigious cycle that you go through. So it's a very useful reminder that this relationship happens on many different levels, and that in an open and democratic society, you can really start to get stuck on some of these what you might consider to be the day-to-day operational relationship, not just the strategic relationship. So it's a useful reminder. I'm quite tempted to ask you to say more about the other things that were on your list of 6. But first, I think we're going to hear from Dr. Han, which I think will bring yet another perspective to our discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon to everyone. I'm honored and privileged to be here today. The timing of this conference couldn't be even more perfect. The organizers scheduled the Korea-US Summit in time for this conference. Maybe it's the other way around, but it's a wonderful achievement. I don't have a background in the military. I have background in political science and some security issues. So I don't have really detailed story to tell you. So let me begin with a personal anecdote. About 5 or 6 years ago, I attended a conference overseas, and I met an American participant. She was a very nice lady, and we had small talks, and then she said how deeply worried you are in the middle of all this nuclear testing and missile testing in South Korea, and she had a pity on me, and she was thinking that I could not probably sleep well at night. That is around the time I was thinking about buying stocks in Korean stock market, because the stock prices were rising, and also I was thinking about what to shop after the conference, because South Korean won was very strong at the time. So I realized that there is a big gap between the perception she has and the reality I was facing. The situation in South Korea, according to her, was very precarious and dangerous. But the Koreans, including myself back then, were not really afraid of anything. We were trying to make money and also buy, do bargain shopping and something. And so that encounter led me to write a small article, provocatively titled, "Are North Korean ICBMs a threat to South Korea?" in which I basically argued that North Korean ICBMs are not direct threat to South Korea, for the simple reason that all these long and medium range missiles, whether nuclear or conventional, their range are not suitable for striking Seoul, which is only 35 miles south of DMZ. So what I tried to say to her was that Americans are increasingly facing danger, whereas South Koreans are not, because all these weapons North Koreans were developing were designed to strike you, but they do not have the capabilities or utilities to strike us. So I'm worried about you rather than you worry about me. But I didn't want to really confront her because we are Koreans and Americans. We like each other. So that ended, that encounter ended in a pleasant conversation, and then ended in me writing a piece on that title. And then I thought that the title may be too provocative, so I removed that from our institute website. But if you search out, that article may be still there. But South Koreans today are facing actually same danger that American lady started to face 6 years ago. Now, North Koreans have shorter range, probably nuclear-headed missiles, and they recently said that they would be willing to use these weapons against South Korean targets. So now Americans and South Koreans are facing same danger. We can be both target of North Korean nuclear missiles. Longer range, the difference is simply longer range in the American case, short range in South Korean case. But I mean, range doesn't matter as long as you are struck by a nuclear warhead, you are dead. So we finally are facing the same danger, and the best tool we have, Koreans have, to deal with such a danger is the alliance we have with Americans. And what I like to say today is, if I may summarize in 2 sentences, my argument is that the nuclear North Korea with its new and expanding missile system is increasingly changing the nature of the security threat that United States and South Korea face today. So we have a fundamental change in the threat we are facing. That's one point. Second point is that for Korean-US alliance, which is now 69 years old, so Mr. Collins was 3 years old when the alliance was formed, if I'm not also 치매 or dementia. And for this almost 7-decade-old alliance to remain relevant, it has to change as well. Because security threat, the nature of security threat has changed. Then so should our alliance. And I like, in the remainder of my talk, I like to suggest 2 ways to change our alliance so that it can help us to deal with the new and emerging change. The first change I like to propose is a new division of roles and responsibilities between 2 allies. Traditionally, United States was the protector and South Korea was the protected. And United States was the leader and South Korea was junior partner or actually follower. this division was fine and even inevitable in the past when South Korea was poor, war-stricken country, unstable, and so on. But today, traditional division of roles and responsibilities in the Korean-US alliance is less credible, and also it may be less effective. For one thing, the protector itself is becoming vulnerable, with North Korean nuclear missiles possibly capable of reaching American cities. United States may soon need to worry about how to defend itself against North Korean nuclear attack. And also United States is mired in a range of domestic problems, including the shortage of baby formulas. And also deal with Russians in Europe and so on. And also don't forget Iranians in the Middle East. So at this very critical moment, there are so many issues coming up, and America as a global superpower has to deal with them all. So I think this may not be the best time for America to be proactive leader in dealing with North Korean threat. And while United States is experiencing all these issues, and Korea is also experiencing a lot of issues as well. We have, just like Americans, we have the pandemic, and also we have domestic problems as well. But mainly, largely thanks to US-Korea alliance, South Korea has become a vibrant democracy, advanced economy, and also military power. Importantly, it takes pride in being a middle power, active middle power, and seeking a corresponding role in international affairs. So in other words, South Korea is very eager to play a bigger role than this traditional division of roles and responsibilities allows in the alliance. So I like to suggest a new thinking, which is that the time may have come for a little reversal of roles and responsibilities between two allies. Maybe United States and South Korea should discuss if and how South Korea, not United States, can lead the United States in resolving all the North Korean crisis. I think the previous South Korean government tried to do that, but it was not complete. And I think because President Yoon and President Biden now have formed a deep bonding, I think they can now talk freely and frankly about changing roles and responsibilities. And I think South Korea is or will be ready to take such a role. Second is a new alliance approach to deal with North Korea. In the pre-nuclear, pre-missile age, it was possible to defend South Korea and the United States against North Korea's attack. But it is increasingly difficult, if not possible, to do so right now. So soon North Korea may become a threat that cannot be technologically or militarily contained. If the nature of a threat fundamentally changes, so should our approach. We already tried all kinds of soft line policies, from sunshine policy or maybe moonshine policy to strategic patience, and then to fire and fury. So the soft line is not fire and fury, but sunshine, moonshine, and strategic patience in engagement and so on. But these soft line policies have not produced the intended outcome. Instead, they may have even helped North Korea to earn the time and resources to develop nuclear weapons. We also tried hardline policies, from economic sanctions to threat of fire and fury, but these hardline policies have not produced the intended outcome either. So we can continue to apply same policies, hard or soft, and hope that someday North Korea, someday they will work and North Korea will change. We can we can continue to do that. We apply same policy, but expect different outcome. But I think that's irrational, wishful thinking. And we have been practicing irrational, wishful thinking for the past 30 years, or maybe even longer. So I'm trying to argue that maybe time has come for a new approach. In order to, I did some work on South Africa, because South Africa is the only country which actually built and dismantled nuclear weapons. We talk about Ukraine. Ukraine did not build nuclear weapons. Ukraine had Soviet nuclear missiles. They had the silos, but they did not have the command and control system. Command and control system was in Moscow, not in the hands of Ukrainians. So what Ukrainians had was just nuclear material placed on missiles over which they have no control. And these missiles need to be maintained regularly to be able to be launched, but they didn't have the technology or resources to maintain these nuclear missiles on a ready state. So I wouldn't count Ukraine as a nuclear country, but I do count South Africa as a nuclear country. And South Africa, South Korea, somewhat similar, but was able to denuclearize. And I have if time comes, I will try to explain how it happened. But the lesson I draw from South African case was that in order to denuclearize North Korea, we need North Korea to explore new ideas and socialize it into a member of the international community. And in other words, there had to be change of ideas and identities. For this kind of ideational change to occur, North Korea need more interactions with the outside world and deeper integration into the international community. However, how kind of distasteful this idea sounds like, and the challenge is to make this kind of interaction and integration possible under the current international sanction regime, and also importantly, North Korea's self-imposed isolation. So we have all these kind of structural conditions that prevent North Korea to interact more with outside world, or to integrate deeper in the international community, and overcoming these difficulties and giving North Korea to change their identity and change their idea is a challenge that South Korea cannot alone meet. And so here we need cooperation with Americans. So there are increasing signs that North Korean threat has changed fundamentally. There are also strong signals that South Korea has changed greatly, not just economically, but also in terms of foreign policy orientation, almost trying to punch above its diplomatic weight. If these are new realities, and the United States do not mind using a little help from its previously junior partner, then the 69-year-old alliance needs to be updated accordingly, and broadening the scope of alliance, which President Biden and President Moon agreed last May, and then also reinforced and expanded between President Biden and President Yoon this past weekend, is a good start. But I would additionally propose a new division of roles and responsibility between the United States and South Korea, and also new approach to socialize and normalize North Korea. This should be also on the agenda for the future bilateral summit. Thank you very much.
Dr. Han, you've really brought us to just where I had hoped we would be in a deeper dive into how the U.S.-ROC relationship is going to, move forward on all the critical issues. So I appreciate that you identified both a structural change, but also the substantive one. So I think to just get us started, and we'll have about 15, 20 minutes of conversation here. So I want to ask all three of you to just see if we can make a matrix in our minds about the, how to rack and stack, as we would say in slang, kind of rack and stack the issues related to North Korea. So in the past, we've been very, doctrinal about denuclearization as the paramount issue. At least for the United States, denuclearization trumps the other considerations. For South Korea, the nuclear question can sometimes be second to reconciliation, peaceful coexistence, etc. So what I've heard today is that while at the summit they used what we could consider old language on nuclear weapons, it was done without quite the same aggressive tone that we've sometimes seen, that denuclearization is the only strategic objective of the United States. We've heard today different ideas about engaging North Korea, peaceful coexistence, and to some extent putting unification a little bit on the back burner. Less prominence, I would say, to the unification topic. But when President Trump sort of shook up the chessboard in U.S.-North Korean relations, we revisited the question of should the U.S. normalize with North Korea? Would that be helpful to the Republic of Korea or unhelpful? And whether we should try harder to end the war, to move from armistice to war termination. So we have this weird set of issues, that some of which are very long-term, some of which are very immediate, and I wanted to just see if we can, if you want to each speak to any of those hard issues, this agenda vis-a-vis North Korea, and see if you think that the agenda should be re-articulated, recalibrated, the sequencing or the relative importance of the issues should change, and whether you think in general there's alignment between our two governments, or whether you see that we're just going to be on parallel tracks and think about these issues separately. So that's kind of a big fat question, but I thought it might be a way to try to wrap up this panel, is to try to really, how would we summarize to a senior official what are the takeaways on how our two countries deal with the challenges, the worsening challenges, as Robert Collins told us, of North Korea. You want to go first?
Well, certainly we need to restart talking directly with North Korean representatives. When I say we, both South Korea and the United States as well. There's a beginning point to me. Dr. Bozak has already left us. He's part of the Bank Secretariat. But you heard him testify that they don't meet very often. They just talk by telephone. And in the past, the JSA has been a place where we could pass information back and forth and make inquiries. In other words, they'd start making a small acorn before they could make the tree, and information was passed back and forth between the two sides. And so restarting that is one of the acorns. Secondly, we had some talks back in the 90s, with 4-party talks and 6-party talks. I'm not sure that 3-party talks would work very well between South Korea, North Korea, and the United States, because the North would see that obviously as too dominant by their perceived enemies. But the concept of the 2-party talks, like President Trump tried to do, was making some progress, at least making some initiative. And Trump came to the JSA and actually walked into North Korea. He invited Kim Young-chol and some others to to his office in the White House. And so these inspired the ability to go ahead and have actual summits. Not successful, obviously, but without talking, you can't get anywhere. To leave it stale is obviously very counterproductive and leads us nowhere. Now, even though we initiate talks, that doesn't mean that we let our hands down in terms of defense. We obviously, if we go into negotiations directly with North Korea, we still have to have the attitude that we have to have a strong background, strong defense as a backdrop to whatever talks that we have. But making the initiative would help. And frankly, President Biden could send out a message directly to, through the media to Kim Jong-un and said, okay, we're willing to have talks, let's do it. And I think that would be a good starting point.
So I think the goal should be very obvious, which is maintaining peace on the Korean Peninsula and Northeast Asia. But we have challenges that were talked about today. Number one, we have a China that has changed its attitude, that it has shown its two true aspirations, which threatens the very way of our lives. Secondly, we have a nuclear-armed North Korea, and for us South Koreans, I don't agree with you that when they had ICBMs it wasn't our problem, because it was our problem, but now that they have tactical nuclear weapons, ladies and gentlemen, to me, that means that a North Korean nuclear weapon can hit any target in South Korea within 3 minutes of launch. That's 180 seconds. Some of you can even hold your breath for 180 seconds. How do we deter that? Think about it. How do we deter that? So that's the problem that I see. Another problem that I see is, let's be frank, the North Koreans, the Chinese, don't take us seriously. Now, we have the ability, we have the technology, but the free world is not a good warfighter in the sense that we don't kill women and children. And as long as we don't kill women and children, states like China and Russia, they will always know that we are pushovers. And so we have three problems: a belligerent, aspirational China, a nuclear-armed North Korea, and all of them and others not taking us seriously. So what do? Obviously, I don't have the answer, but I have one thing for you to think about. First, I think we must guarantee the security of the Korean people as well as the Japanese people. And at this point, I would like to ask you, why do you think the North Koreans are threatening to shoot missiles at the Japanese? Just because they hate them for the things that they did during the colonial years? No, you should find out. So the number one step is to guarantee the security of the Koreans and the Japanese. If that happens, I think I would have no problem with Washington having an embassy in Pyongyang, or Pyongyang having an embassy in Washington, D.C., or all the sanctions lifted. I don't care. I would be comfortable with that. I think this is what the North Koreans claim is not threatening their regime. Now, it'll be a distasteful step for us, because for me personally, I am very concerned about North Korean human rights. But let's assume that we just did that. I see the following benefits. Number one, when North Korea succeeded in their initial nuclear test, people have told me that Kim Jong-il exclaimed, "Now we don't have to worry about China." It's amazing that he said that. He didn't say we don't have to worry about the capitalists or the United States or the Japanese. He said, now we don't have to worry about China. So it seems it is very clear that the North Koreans have no love for the Chinese. Maybe the missiles that are now that are being aimed at Washington, D.C. and New York City won't be aimed there at all. Maybe the North Korean nuclear weapon problem will actually become a Chinese problem. Secondly, arms reduction. Right now, because South Korea does not have nuclear weapons, the North Koreans are trying to deal with the United States on denuclearization. This is, to me, absurd. But one option of guaranteeing South Korean security is by having South Korea have its own nuclear weapons. If we did that, we might actually start a nuclear reduction on the Korean Peninsula. Now, South Korea having nuclear weapons will increase the likelihood of nuclear war. But it is only then that human beings will finally decide to talk to each other, because they know that they live in a world that is so dangerous. Because like I said, 180 seconds, not only for South Korea, but North Korea. It is only then, I believe, that true dialogue will occur. And I believe that if we are able to maintain this kind of balance, that North Korea is a system where they're afraid of K-pop and Coca-Cola. So I think we will win over them. But the true key is to be able to maintain peace for at least 50 years. And at the end, we probably will be able to achieve the initial goal, which I said was maintaining peace. Now, I subtly submitted to you South Koreans having nuclear weapons. This is something that we really need to think about. What is in our best interest? And I think that's something that we need to talk with our Americans. But if that's just too hard for you right now, we have a lot of nuclear fuel that is being spent, that is being stored drum by drum. And we need to reprocess that spent fuel. Now, the Japanese can do it. How come we can't? Explain to me why Koreans are not trusted enough that we cannot, reprocess our nuclear spent fuel. The weapons-grade plutonium that comes out of that reprocessing process, if you want it back in Philadelphia, we'll ship it to you. But I think it's a good idea to leave it in Korea. So let me just stop there, and that's just one option that I lay to you.
The question of normalizing diplomatic relations with North Korea, I think, comes up rather frequently in United States expert and also policymakers. And whether it will help is both theoretical and also empirical question as well. Then I think it's best to examine American experience with China, for instance. United States normalized diplomatic relations with China, and then also normalized trading relations with China, hoping that China become another country just like United States. And that experiment may have not been very successful. And United States also tried something similar with Russia. And then we know what happened between Ukraine and then Russia. What I'm trying to suggest is that there may be a limit what we can do to change certain countries from outside, and North Korea and China, and probably Russia seem to belong to that in a very special group of countries. And so I'm trying to say that normalization, it may not be very effective, but still we need to try that. because we don't have many kind of ammunitions in our toolbox. I think the United States and South Korean summit this time was mainly about deterrence. There are many ways to respond to a nuclear country. At the most basic level, you need the nuclear country not to use nuclear weapons. You need to deter the nuclear country, and which is what I think Moon and Yoon did this time. They strengthened and reconfirmed nuclear umbrella against North Korea. But we should go beyond that. Deterrence is the initial step, but the next step should be denuclearization. And I don't think there were much detailed discussions between two summits about how to denuclearize North Korea. But that's something they need to talk about, and the discussions need to translate into actual policies of South Korea and the United States. And this is something I'm looking forward to seeing in the months to come, because as Dr. Lee said, this government is only 2 weeks old. Even Mr. Collins was 3 years old when the alliance was formed. We need to wait maybe at least three years. And one last, if I may, one last point. Eventually, South Korea is not worried about Americans having nuclear weapons. We are not worried about the British having nuclear weapons, the French having nuclear weapons. Why? Because we believe that we share the same values, so we can trust them. So, when we share values together, then military weapons do not harm our relations. And eventually, the best way to go is for North Koreans to have same values or similar values with the rest of us, and for North Koreans to form such to have such values, they need socialization, they need interaction, and again, the dilemma is how to allow them to have socialization and interactions while we maintain sanctions and they maintaining self-isolation. That's the puzzle we need to solve.
Thank you so much. We've covered a lot of ground in this panel and throughout the day. We've got, I will take 2 really quick questions, and then we're going to have our final session, which will be a wrap-up and some farewell remarks. Why don't I turn to this gentleman here? Succinct question if you can, and please identify yourself.
Thank you. My name is Ilya Kim, and I'm a Global Affairs Major from George Mason University. I have a question for Lieutenant General. You've been talking a lot about ramping up US-Korea alliance, but I wanted to ask you a topic of South Korea deploying SAT systems a couple of years ago. And I want to ask whether South Korea can afford economic sanctions that can follow by the Chinese.
Well, unfortunately, THAAD or NORTHAAD, looks like we're going to have to brace ourselves for a real big storm coming from the West, because already the Chinese are warning us that our actions so far has really enraged them. So I think the course is already set. There are very few alternatives, and unfortunately the Chinese don't respect us. The real question for me is, what are the Americans going to do for me when I'm doing all this? Are you going to abandon us like the last time with that? You know? How come Korean students, after they graduate, can't get a job in the United States because of visa issues? How come more North Korean defectors can't get to the United States? How come we can't have a what do you call it? Currency swap. You know? We're going to have a big economic challenge in about 10 months. We're going to need that currency swap. How come we can't get that? No. If you want us to be a foundry for all this high-tech stuff, you need a healthy Korean economy. What else besides extended deterrence are you going to give us? And oh, by the way, I really don't like conventional weapons being included in the extended deterrence, comments. You students should figure out why I don't like that. So the real question is, what will the United States and other like-minded countries do for us? What will Japan do for us? The Yoon government has taken a big step on the other side. So that should be the real question. Thank you.
So I feel like we've just added about 5 new topics that we should be, at CSPS-K, you've got your issues for next time. We're not done with these issues. I really think we should, one very last question, Danielle, very succinct, please. And then we'll switch to the final session.
Hello, sorry. I'm Danielle. I'm a biodefense student in Arlington. Mr. Collins, you spoke at length about the issues of the healthcare system in the DPRK. Could you discuss that within the context of the threat to the alliance? In the case of a hypothetical collapse, you have a large population, about 26 million, that has not had consistent access to good health care. They're chronically malnourished. Could you discuss that in the context of infectious disease threats, particularly within how much resources it takes to integrate a defector into the society under the best of conditions? If we're talking about a collapse, what does that look like in terms of the health security threats here?
Danny, thank you very much for the question. The healthcare system has not been resourced since 1991. And today, if a North Korean gets sick and wants to obtain medicine and whatnot, he or she has to go directly to the doctor. The doctor's going to have to find a way to bring the medicine from China, or the patient is going to have to find a broker to get the medicine and bring it back. The system is, because the system is pretty much collapsed. The regime hasn't been funding the system for the last 30 years properly, other than the primary care hospitals that are for the elite within Pyongyang. The problem with the healthcare system is that it can't treat those that are malnourished, and so they become instantly more threatened by diseases that are already there long before the coronavirus. Tuberculosis is a major problem in North Korea, and there's a number of others that are problems. And not only that, but a subset of the health science in North Korea is sanitation, is a real major issue in North Korea also. There's nothing modern about, once you get outside of Pyongyang, there's nothing modern about the sanitation issues that are in the village. It is very basic. They use human excrement for much of their fertilizer. This causes some problems. And you probably are aware of one of the last military defectors that came across at the JSA. He was shot 3 times and survived, got over on the sides, and then put into the South Korean military hospital, and they found tapeworms throughout his body, without a system. And that's a problem in North Korea, that you can't get treated until you realize that the problem is very, very bad. And even then, the doctor may not have the medicine for you. Now, if you think about North Koreans coming to South Korea, there's about 34,000 of them. Many come in very, very poor shape, but when most of them go to the Hanwon facility, which is a transition facility, and they get very good food and they get health care, and they spend, I think it's 2.5 or 3 months within this facility getting briefed up on what life is like in South Korea, which is very different. They have, the same culture, but they have a very different social network. and so they have to learn. And not all of them end up liking being here and try to go to other places, but most of them obviously stay here. But and they get better health care, obviously. But again, if they're ever in some form of conflict where where South Koreans come in contact with North Koreans, there's going to be some significant problems in terms of disease, transmission thereof. And the experience of World War I with the Spanish flu, which is kind of, at that time considered, a massive problem, just like we see the coronavirus today. It was because of the intermingling and our lack of understanding of the very undeveloped health environment back then. Well, that's where North Korea is now. And so just in some sort of instability scenarios where North Koreans start just coming across the militarized zone because the military has broken down its control, that's going to end up creating a real problem for South Koreans. And it's because the health system hasn't been funded for the last 30 years.
Once again, Mr. Sunshine over here, giving us happy things to think about. But really wonderful, wonderful panel. Thank you very much. I think we should give a round of applause to these wonderful speakers.
So my last task for the day is to provide us a little bit of a summary. We heard so many interesting things that I am not going to do justice to all the interesting insights that we had throughout the day. But I've tried to just distill it down to about 5 themes for further reflection and see if this, I'm sure some of you would have other things that you'd want to put on this list. So first I'd like to start with sort of broader ways to think about security. I think that was a recurring theme. It's something that Roland Wilson discussed with our students yesterday. So while some of us are, come from an academic discipline of security studies that is a fairly traditional look at kind of hard security problems and the questions related to the use of force, I think what we've heard is that we have to have a more agile and flexible definition of what's in the security basket. So there's economic security, there's food security, there's and that the two leaders of the Republic of Korea and the US certainly use the word security in well beyond just the hard security challenges of what should be the military capabilities to deter and hopefully prevent conflict with North Korea or with any other adversary. For the United States, of course, it could be a China-related scenario. I thought we should mention the important theme of deglobalization that we heard earlier in the day, of whether some of the things that have triggered some of the economic insecurities around the world, supply chain disruptions, maldistribution of food resources, etc., are in part are both caused by and causing this phenomenon of people not really trusting this total integration of a globalized world. And so we are seeing pushback from that, and it has secondary effects that even relate to some of the agenda that we've talked about in the Korean Peninsula. We heard in a few discussions shortcomings of governance, and this could be everything from misgivings about how the UN is organized in the demilitarized zone, the fragile ecosystem of the Kim dynasty, where decisions are not made in a very information-rich environment, polarization of the United States, the uncertainty of whether our political pendulum is swinging so that other countries can't really settle in on working with an incumbent American administration because they're already seeing that a very different administration could get voted in short order. Some political polarization here in the Republic of Korea, very close, evenly divided society, a little bit like the United States, between more liberal party and a more conservative party, and even some concerns about the rise of populism at the margins of Korean politics. But on a more upbeat note, I think we also heard a number of examples of Korea, not just, I mean, we framed our visit here as Northeast Asian security, but what we've also heard is that the Republic of Korea is already fully accepted and desires to be seen as a global actor. So Korea is bigger than just a Northeast Asian country, it is a global actor, and we've seen that in a number of manifestations in our discussion today. When we come to the very tricky issues of North Korea, I think, and I won't be able to do justice to this, but certainly from an American perspective, it is nuclear weapons that kind of frames the discussion. It's, but for now for many years, we've had a rather passive policy on what we can actually do to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula. So I think we heard a more subtle discussion today that really, and maybe this is also a way to think about the success of the summit, that revalidating deterrence, revalidating an American ROK partnership that includes nuclear weapons on the good guy side as a way of deterring more aggressive behavior by North Korea is still, you know, the here and now policy. Total denuclearization, arms control, you know, a disarmament strategy for the Korean Peninsula, that is really, at this point, over the horizon. We're not really talking too much about that now. But we did hear from Dr. Han and others lots of, you know, kind of short to medium term ideas about how to stimulate or initiate some kind of a more constructive engagement with North Korea. And I think what we heard from a number of Korean speakers was you got to start talking even if you know that you profoundly disagree on many issues, but some level of contact after the extra isolation caused by COVID there seems to be a demand on the Korean side for, you know, non-judgmental engagement, not engagement that is premised on the North Koreans changing their behavior in order to talk, but how do you open channels of communication even before you have any evidence of real change. I think we did identify quietly that we don't see China the same way. The United States and the Republic of Korea, we heard from one speaker that they really don't see a military threat from China, that China is a neighbor to be managed, a very big neighbor, very powerful neighbor, but the United States is clearly organizing its Indo-Pacific strategy around the notion that the relationship with China is largely competitive and it need not be, and adversarial, it need not be confrontational. So how does the United States stay within these boundaries that are short of open conflict with China? But again, back to the global point, and maybe I'll just end here, that the Republic of Korea has to be able to do more than one thing, that this is no longer a small developing country whose existential issue is its relationship with its northern neighbor that used to be part of the same country. But that the Korean agenda can be actually much broader. It can be a global agenda, and North Korea can be one of the problems on the list, but not the sole organizing principle of Korea's national security strategy. So I thought that was a useful thing to reflect on, of what are some of the consequences of Korea's success and of the very long and disturbing impasse with North Korea, but not an expectation that North Korea is the only issue for the Republic of Korea. So anyway, I think that we could tease out a lot more nuances and a lot more areas of convergence and divergence between the United States and Korea, but those are at least a very short list of things that perhaps some of you would like to amend and revise as opportunities present. So I think it's been a very rich and engaging day. We've been delighted at the quality of the questions from the students. And so I thank you all for joining us for this CSPS Symposium. And as I said a few minutes ago, we can very easily identify some new and additional topics in both the bilateral relationship, but also thinking about regional security for future events. So thank you all very much. And I think we are going to have some closing remarks from the Associate Dean.
We're going to try this one more time. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Excellent. That lunch definitely settled well with you. I'd like to hear that. I want to just first say thank you, Professor Laipson, for your concluding remarks. The summary of the events of the day, the themes that have emerged. Students, this is what we hope that happens at events like this, that we start to imagine the through lines of the conversations that are then the beginning of new conversations that then become the beginning of new conversations. So take these as the beginnings of your next conversations. And so thank you for setting that up for us to be thinking about. So students, colleagues, and guests, what an amazing day this has been. I hope that you've enjoyed the conversations with and among our distinguished panelists as much as I have. My closing remarks for today were prepared, but then honestly I made the decision to go back and modify them a little bit based on some of the reflections that I had on some of the discussions from earlier in the day. So I ask that you indulge me for a few moments as I reflect on some of the things that I had an opportunity to learn. I want to begin by providing a brief overview of the key takeaways that I've gained from the events of today. And then I will invite you to reflect on the same. First, I reflect on the discussions of the day as a faculty member focused on teaching. The presence of graduate students from the Schar School, undergraduate students from Mason, Korea, and our other IGC institutions, alongside faculty and scholars from across multiple fields, has afforded a set of scaffolded discussions modeling how true intellectual inquiry should proceed. The questions asked by students during the sessions demonstrate their stellar training. Now, I may be biased because I am a Mason faculty member, but the discussions before, during, and after the panels, because we are in person, have allowed for the reduction of hierarchical boundaries. Students have become comfortable talking with faculty and practitioners, with one another, and practitioners have been seeking out student insight as their questions have pushed the envelope on these intellectual discussions. As a faculty member, this reduction of barriers for intellectual exchange is precisely what I see the point of higher education to be, especially the kind of education that Mason and Mason Korea stand for. Therefore, this symposium is the ultimate kind of introduction to intellectual dialogue, while parties are equal contributors and have equal opportunity to move forward and to create change. Second, I come to this space as an academic. I'm trained as a sociologist, focusing on the intersection of work and family lives, and how higher education can be used to reduce social inequalities. I therefore view this symposium through the lens of interlocking institutions that reflect the shifting global landscape. Nation states, non-governmental organizations, and strategic political alliances and organizations are all institutions that have prominently been on display here today. Drawing on the expertise of the academic and practitioners in the field of security policy studies, we've engaged in deep discussion on the future implications of current policies centered on Korea-US relations. As a sociologist, I'm also reminded that social institutions are comprised of people, actors, whose social interactions create and reaffirm the institutions that we at times reify as acting as independent agents. The insights from our first panel in particular remind us that international policy does not exist in a vacuum, that nations and their citizens work in tandem to create and actively modify our lived experiences regarding what one speaker called negative peace versus positive peace. Individuals consume information and respond to that information as citizens and as political actors. I invite us to continue to think through the implications of peace and security if we focus on the macro level without the inclusion of the people whose lives are directly affected by the experience of peace and security every day. So what should we collectively take away from this symposium? Well, I ask you to think about how you can use the intellectual, practical, everyday knowledge to think and work towards a deeper understanding of peace and security on the Korean Peninsula. Not all of us can become policy analysts, government officials, or diplomats. Not all of us can be mediators or conflict negotiators or military strategists. But we all have the opportunity to be public intellectuals. We all have the opportunity to take the content from each of these panels to our publics. Our publics can be our peers, regardless of who we are and where we are professionally housed. Our publics can be our elected leaders with whom we engage as citizens. Our publics could be our followers on social media. We each have the opportunity to think through what peace and security can truly mean and how it can be actualized in Northeast Asia, but especially and particularly here on the Korean Peninsula. So I invite each of you to take away at least one action item from today. Let's conclude with more than just an agreement to continue in our intellectual and engagement. You know, we do this all the time. Yes, we agree to continue to talk. Let's do more than talk. Let's conclude with a commitment to do, to be, and to act. The Mason graduate is an engaged citizen and well-rounded scholar who is prepared to act in the global world. So let's commit to enacting the education that we say we provide to our students, serving as engaged citizens of the world. Use the knowledge gained from today, the skills that you've been practicing and that you've been prepared with to act and go and do and be and change the world. I want to close by thanking Dr. Ji-Hee Lim, the student fellows at CSPS-K for their Herculean effort for enabling this symposium. I thank the panelists for their insights, their questions, and their true intellectual authenticity. And I thank each of you for your engagement and your attendance today. I wish all of you a safe and healthy evening, and for those who are visiting us, a wonderful rest of your trip here to Korea. 감사합니다.